I'll start with a quick review for this book, Argumentation. It's actually a course by the Great Courses. I'll refer this course as a book, the study of effective reasoning. So I'll give this book 3 out of 5. I think there is some good overall overview of argumentation. I think the professor is really very good in clarity, in terms of clarity and summarizing. Very clear what he's talking about. Some things just very routine things about argumentation. And what I took out of the book is that there's so many details about argumentation that learning argumentation is not as easy as it might seem. Learning the theory is not very helpful, I think, in argumentation, because there is so many ways you can go with it. There is so many things you can do and not do. You have to be I wouldn't say natural at this, but learning this is only helpful when you already have some baseline. Learning only from this is not the way to go. But I think there were some interesting parts, some less interesting parts about argumentation. But I think it was a good overview overall, but nothing too crazy. So therefore 3 out of 5. Let's see the notes. The argument should be audience dependent. What works for one audience would not work for others. We have to know who is our audience, because different audiences have different arguments they would prefer. We can attack the claim, the evidence of inference, and the conclusion of the argument. Those are the things we can attack, potentially. The claim itself, the evidence or inferences that led by the evidence, or the conclusion of the argument. Those all we can attack. Convergent argument is composed of arguments that can stand by their own, while series argument is composed of arguments that are linked in and dependent on one another. So that's the differences between convergent to series arguments. Convergent is different arguments, each can stand by their own, but series arguments, it's many arguments that each dependent on the previous or the other arguments. Arguments can be strong or weak, not just valid or invalid as in formal logic or symbolic or logic. There is the differences. It can be on a spectrum. Logic is either valid or invalid, but arguments can be stronger or weaker. So in a way, it's on a spectrum. One way to respond to an attack is by recontextualizing the question. So this is one way we could respond to a potential attack, is by recontextualizing, so making a connection to a different thing that is related, but making it about something else. Focusing too much on the opponent's argument can divert attention from our own argument. So that if we defend our side only by focusing on the opponent's argument, is in a way strengthening their side, because we are talking about their argument again. So we have to know to do the right thing. The hip is claiming that no one increment is the culprit for the change, and therefore X. That's the hip. And it could be a bias, could be a fallacy, could be not. But the claim is that there is no one increment in which we can say that something has happened. Since when a potato is a potato, it's something like that. If there is no point, therefore X. That's the hip. That's what we call the hip. Side note, the professor is great at recapping and summarizing. He's doing it very well. So he says, like, for example, in last lecture we spoke about this, and at the end of a lecture he might summarize things. Very helpful. Not many professors or authors are doing that. So that's part 1. There is 2 parts of this audiobook or course. The fallacy of division is that one part is not necessarily the same when taking apart. That's a fallacy of division. Because when we take things apart, the parts itself are probably not, sometimes they're not the same as a whole. The judicial analogy is saying that similar cases should treat it similarly. That's the judicial analogy, that every similar case should be judged similar to the way the other case has been judged. Making a diagram of circles is helpful determining the validity of a few arguments. So we have a few arguments, we're trying to understand which one is good. So drawing circles and seeing the overlapping areas will help us understand the validity. An example of begging the question is, quote, have you stopped beating your wife, end quote, where there is no answer is good. We first need to establish that it even happened in the first place. So that's the example of begging the question, because when we ask, have you stopped beating your wife? If you say yes, that meant you did it before. If you say no, that's even worse. So there is no good answer. What's going on there, and it's a fallacy, that we first need to establish that it even happened in the first place. Did it even happen? An example of circular reasoning is the existence of God based on the Bible. That's circular reasoning, and it's a problem when arguing this way. You can't basically argue against it because God exists. How do you know? Basically, it says in the Bible. Who wrote the Bible? God. So it's a circular reasoning. The fact that an argument fails under a fallacy doesn't automatically disqualify it. It depends on the situation. I think this is one of the most important part in this book or course, because many arguments would fall into fallacies. You gave many examples, because basically every argument in a way falls in under a fallacy. So what he says is depends on the situation. And the last one, good way to judge an argument is whether it develops or shut down the conversation. I think that's also a good rule of thumb, is does the argument advance the conversation or shut it down? If it shut it down, it's like circular reasoning, for example. There's nowhere you can respond to it. That's not an effective argument. But if it advances the conversation, that would be a good argument. So that's it for the notes. Again, there are some interesting parts. I would recommend, if you didn't have too much prime knowledge about argumentation, I took a class about it, even two, and read other books, so I haven't learned that much about it, but there is definitely some good information in there. Thank you.